and welcome to part 2 of using FX maps within Substance Designer. In this video, we're going to pick up where we left off and we're going to continue to create dynamic functions for these properties. So we were just about to work with rotation, and I've gone ahead and just set this rotation to 0. So right now we're not having any rotation, and we have these iterations here. We're working with 10 iterations, and we need to randomize that. So what we're going to do is take a look at our pattern rotation. Here are our turns. This is a float value. So let's come up to our color luminosity. This is where we're actually housing our functions. And let's start to build this. So what we're going to do first is create a constant float. And this is going to be between 0 and 1. So I'm going to go ahead and just place that at 1. The next thing I'm going to do is create a new random function. And we'll go ahead and just make this connection here. So we'll plug these guys together. And then finally what we want to do is set a variable. So we're going to do variable set, and I'm going to call this rotate. And then what I'm going to do is go ahead and start to create another sequence. So right now we have a sequence that's running this branch and this branch of a graph. So let's just go ahead and go to our control and sequence. And then all we have to do is just plug these values in. Now, what I'm going to do is set this to output. Before I do that, I want you to take notice at what happens to the random values. So I'm going to go ahead and click set as output, and you can see that we do get a slight change. Now, the reason being is that we have some random nodes here. So we've got 3 so far in this graph. And each time you create a new random node, it's going to be utilizing a different seed. And since we are actually changing the sequence of this graph, since we've added a new branch here to this graph, and we're changing that sequence, this random ID here is firing and getting a certain value. Then it's actually changing the random seed that was working on our size. So that's why we get that to change. So now what we're going to do is go back to our quadrant. Let's go back to our pattern rotation and set an empty function. And just as we did before, we're going to go ahead and set that to the variable. So I'm inside the dynamic function graph for that rotation. I'm going to right click. I'm going to go to add element variables here, and I'm going to say get float. And then here I just need to type in the name, which was rotate. And once I have that set, we'll right click the node and do set as output. So now you see we're starting to get some really nice variation here. And we'll go back to our FX map. Let's select that iterate node, and again, I can change the iteration. So now when I start to change this, you can see the type of pattern that we're getting. You can also see this working here on the 3D view as well. So the next thing that we want to work with is going to be our pattern size. So let's do the same thing. Let's go to our color luminosity. Let's go into that function graph. And let's go ahead and just select these nodes, and we'll frame them as well. So just so we can keep things nice and organized. So this is rotate, if I could spell that right. Okay, so let's start building up another sequence here. So this time I'm going to do a constant float. I'm going to do 2 of these guys. So I'm going to copy and paste this. Now the first one, this is going to be talking about our width and our height. So for our width, I'm going to go ahead and just set this to 0.01. And for our height, we're going to change this to something larger, like say 3. And let's go ahead and add 2 randoms here. So hit the space bar again, random. So now I have 2 random. Let's go ahead and make these connections. And then we're going to want to compile these into a vector 2. So we hit the space bar, we go to vector, float vector 2. And again, if we kind of zoom in on this 2 inputs here, the first one is going to be our width. The second one is going to be our height. So now we have this in place. Let's go ahead and set a variable for this that we can reference. So variables set. And this, I'll just call this, this will be our size offset. Actually, I'm just going to copy this. And now let's go ahead and just add this into the sequence. So what we'll do is we'll go to control, sequence, and we'll go ahead and hook this up. And just as we did, we'll right click, set the new sequence as output. It's going to shuffle our randomization. Let's grab these guys here. Let's right click. Let's add a frame. And let's just basically label these guys, their size. Let's go back to our FX map. Let's go to our size. Let's do an empty function. let's go in and let's grab a variable. So we're going to get a float2. So remember that was a vector2 that we were using. And here we'll just paste in our size offset, hit return so we can make sure that we set that. Right click the node, set as output. And so now we've got a variation on our size. And if we take a look in our 3D view, we're starting to build up an effect that looks like actual scratches. And if we go back here, you can see that the parameters we've been working with are offset. We've randomized offset, size, rotation. And so far, this is building up a pretty nice effect. Now, we're going to start to create a new branch because we want to vary this. So when I was first looking at these scratches, you can see that, well, it is giving us a scratch-like pattern, but all of the scratches are very, very straight. And we want to introduce a little bit more variation into this, some curvature or some scratches that just, that aren't so straight, basically. And we're going to do that by adding in another branch. So let me just kind of move this branch over a little bit, and we're going to utilize a switch node. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the space bar, and I'm going to grab switch. Now in the first video, I briefly spoke about switch. It's one of the 3 nodes that we're going to use. And if we're taking a look at this graph here that we're working with, and we're thinking of it as a process tree, and we're starting again here from the top, moving to the bottom, we can actually branch out separate sections of this graph to process with different types of variations and effects. And we can do that here with the switch. So let's grab our iteration. So what we're doing is we're saying, hey, we're taking those 10 iterations that we want to work with. So really the way I look at it is this node, it's containing a number that we're going to use. Okay, so something that's going to repeat. It's going to let us repeat across this graph. And I'm going to grab that and throw it here into the switch. Okay, so now we've kind of broken our chain here. And what we're going to do is if we take a look at the switch node, it has a selector parameter that says left or right. So I'm going to switch this over to right for now, and we have 2 outputs. This is basically output 0 and 1, but think of it as left and right. Let's grab the right output and just plug that back, and now you can see that we get everything back in play here. And we have this switch node. If I go to the switch node and I switch between right and left, you can see that I'm basically set up a toggle between I'm viewing this or I'm viewing actually nothing over here. So let's start building up a new branch. I'm going to go ahead and grab myself a quadrant node, and just as I did here, I want to actually put a subdivision into this. So with this quadrant node selected, again, we're not doing anything with the parameters. This is just going to be our subdivision. So I'm going to hit spacebar again and hit quadrant. And so now we have another quadrant just as we set up before. Let's go into this second output here for our switch, and let's plug this in. So now you can see that we have an iteration. We're switching between a left and a right side, and now we need to start building up effects for our right side. And what we're going to do is we're going to utilize another feature of these FX maps. So if we come over to this final piece over here, you can see that we have patterns. And I can actually input, patterns, or I can supply a user image. And so that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to supply a user image. And we're going to do the same thing we did before with this new image that's being input into the FX map. We're going to vary it. So here we are back at the main graph, and I have this shape that I created here in Substance Designer. And as you recall, we started with the shape, and it was more, when we first created that the scratch effect here, we started with a similar shape that was like a small slit like this, except it was very straight. And now I've done the same thing, except added or introduced a slight curve to it, and that was placed here in the FX node. You can see under image input image 1 right here, it's plugged right in. And here's how I actually created that. So I started with just a uniform color. It's set to grayscale. Then I added a transform 2D, and I took the width and just scaled it in on the width a great deal and set the tiling to no tiling. Then I went and grabbed the linear gradient that you can find here in the library, and it's grayscale, so I just fed it into this gradient that you see here, and I set a few keys. So here we have the dark key here, one at the beginning and the end, and then this white. And what this gradient ramp is doing for me is it's basically setting the areas that are actually going to be warped based off this directional warp. So I had a directional warp. If you hit the space bar, you can come over here to directional warp. That's here in the operational nodes, and the image that I just created here with the transform 2D is fed into the input, and this gradient map is fed into the intensity input. And so now if I go back to those keys and I start to change these keys, I can actually change how this is going to get warped along. So notice, if you think about, like, if you look at this gradient, this is like the bottom of the image, and all the way over here to the right is the top of the image. So black means that no warping is taking place, and the white is where the warp is happening. So as I start to move this node, you can see that I'm basically warping that straight line into a curve to basically get just this curve like this. And again, I'm just using that as my input image, and that's fed into the input image of the FX map. So now we'll go into our FX map graph, and we'll come over to that quadrant here. Well, first let's go to our switch node, and let's take the selector and let's look at this left branch that we're going to be working with here. Let's zoom in on that quadrant node, and on that last quadrant node, we're going to set the pattern to input image 1. And so now we have a similar effect that we did when we first started this branch here. So we have this iteration node that's iterating this input image 10 times. It's getting passed through this switch. We're now viewing this branch. That image is then subdivided by this first quadrant node and displayed by the second quadrant node as indicated by the pattern 1 setting. So now we want to go ahead and, just as we did before, vary these properties with dynamic functions. And a quick way of doing that is just to come over here to this node, and we're going to come in and take a look at that function graph here. And it looks like I made a mistake here. I actually have size written twice. This is actually supposed to be the position. So this is supposed to be our position here, and I actually named this wrong as well. I named it size, and then this one up here I named it size offset, I think. This would actually be position. So let me just change that real quick. So here, let's come in here and just name this POS for that. Let's go back to our FX map. Let's go to this quadrant. Let's go to our pattern offset, and let's just make sure that this is targeted correctly. And before we continue on, let's go back to our selector, and okay, we're good. So everything's set up correctly. So let's jump back into this guy's graph here. Let's copy this. Let's go to this node here, and let's paste it. Now, the reason why we can paste this and we can work with the same variables is because the variables that we're creating with the set variable, they are local to this quadrant node. So we're placing them here in this top parameter. Remember, the parameter is going to process from the very top parameter all the way down. And these variables are local to this particular node. So they're just local variables. They can't be affected by other nodes. So we'll come into the, we'll create an empty function for this, and we'll paste this in. We'll come over here to this final sequence node. We'll set this as output, and then we will just start feeding things in. So position, we have rotate, and our size offset. So let's come over to our graph. Let's go to our pattern rotation, and let's do an empty function for this. We'll hit the button here to go into the graph. We will go in variable, we'll get a float, and then we will get the rotation, and we'll set this as output. And this didn't actually work for me. I actually had the variable named wrong, so you have to make sure that we get this right. It's actually rotate. And so as soon as I get that right, you can see that we're now getting the rotation correct. So then we'll do the same thing. We'll come over here to our pattern offset. Empty, did I hit that right there? Empty function. Here, let's do this. I think I hit expose. Let me clear that. And we will come over here and say empty function. And then I will go and get a float 2 for this. And for this, we had position as POS. And we set as output. Now you see that we're starting to change here, randomize our position. And let's do the same thing here for our size. Empty function. Get float 2. I believe I called that size. Nope, I think I changed it to size output. Let me check that. Whoops. Move the set node there. Yeah, size out offset. Let's just change that to size. And let me check what values I have here for this. So this guy here, we're going to want to keep at 1 because in that case, in the first one, we had it set because we had started with that Gaussian shape. And we had to change the width. In this case, for these curves, we don't want to do that. And so for this, we might actually change the value for these curves down a bit. So I'm just going to pull these guys down to maybe something like maybe, 1.2 or so. Here, let's just make it a 1.25. Sounds like a nice number to use. So now you can see where we're getting kind of these curve type shapes there. And we'll bring this back in. Okay, so at this point we have a graph here. We have 2 branches. We have curved section here, and then we have the straight scratch section here, and we can swap back and forth between the two. And so now what we want to do is we want to modulate this selector so that we can blend between the two instead of just this kind of on-off switch. We want to be able to basically be more variable between these 2 branches. So we have our selector. What we're going to do is come over here and create an empty function, and we'll go into that function. And we're going to start with a constant. So the constant being 0 is going to be the left, and 1 is going to be the right. And we want to randomize that value between 0 and 1. So we'll click random. So we have the 0, and we're going to randomize between that. So let's go ahead and just change this right now to 1 here. So we do a randomization between that value, 0 and 1. And then what we're going to do is we're going to come over here, and we're going to do a comparison greater. And I'll plug this guy in here. Now, what do we want to compare against is another float value. And so I'll plug this into here. And so this value that we're going to compare against, and I'm going to set this to 0.5. So it's kind of like the middle part between, 0 being one side and 1 being the other side. And this value, I think it's like around 0.46 or so, is going to be, most of the time it's going to fall within that particular range of 0.46. For this, the way this randomization is going to work on this. So that's why we're going to create this at 0.05 because we're going to use this as almost as a way of like creating a tolerance between how much we blend. And that'll make more sense when we actually set this as an output. So let's right click and say set as output. Now when we do that, you can see that we now have the straight lines and we have some of the curves all in place. If I select this float value, I can actually start to weight this basically. So if I start to weight it more towards 0 here, well, let me get out of the negative here. If I start to weight more towards 0, it's mainly the straight lines. And if I weight more towards 1, it's more of the curved. So I'm going to put this around, maybe around 0.46 or so. So I get kind of a nice blend between the two in this comparison that we have here. And so now we'll go back. And so what we have now are 2 branches. We have a curved branch and we have a straight branch of scratches. Both are being iterated 10 times. So you can see I can start to change the iteration here as I start to move this across. So here we'll pull this up some more. We can change this. We can even increase this if we want more iterations of this. So maybe take this up to something like, say, 20. So now we get even more scratches with that. So that's another control that we can create there. Here you can see on the 3D in the 3D view what this is actually looking like with that. So at this point we have our iterations. We have a switch that's being modulated, and it's using that 0.46, 0.5 means that it's kind of half the time. It's even. This is, I guess, a way to say it is evenly getting half of this branch and half of this branch. So it's not really weighted one more than the other, unless I actually go in, like I showed you before, and use that float and actually weight it beyond that to a certain degree. And then we are using the quadrant to divide that, and then grabbing an input image 1, which we created, and then on the right branch here, same thing, quadrant to divide it. That last quadrant node is then using a specific pattern. all of the pattern or all of the properties for both of these quadrant nodes here are all being randomized through functions. So at this point, we end up going through and we create the effect that we actually want to create. Now we have the noise pattern that we want to create with this. And here, if we come back to our main graph, this becomes the FX node that we just created. And then what I'm doing here is I'm actually outputting this here to an output. So in this case, I'm going to switch this output. I have it set to diffuse right now. I'm actually going to change this. Well, actually, I'll worry about that here in just a minute. For now, though, what I want to do is I want to create a couple parameters that I can work with. So if I just double-click to get to the root level of this graph, you can see that I actually have 2 input parameters that I created. The first one is integer. So what I did was I just clicked this plus sign here, named this integer a float slider. So let's just undo that and take a look at what this is. And it has a default value of 40, a minimum of 1, and a max of 200, and it's called amount. So what we're going to do with this is we're actually going to use this in our iteration. So what I want to do is go back to my FX. Let's come over here to our iteration, and instead of 10, I'm actually going to create an empty function out of this. I'm going to come into that function. I'm going to right-click, add element, variables, get float, or excuse me, not float, it's an integer. Let's do that again. Variables, get integer. And from this dropdown, since this is part of the root graph, we can just pick it through the dropdown. We'll call this amount, right-click, set as output. And now I can actually use this here to drive this effect. So if I just double-click out here into my viewport, I come over here to the default is 40. I can pull this down, and you can see that now I have a nice control for these scratches. I'm going to go ahead and I'll keep that maybe at 320 in this case. And so now I have this nice control that I can use. So let's go ahead and just maybe default this at Hibbs at 40. I'll just leave it here at 35. And so this is what I'm getting. And you can see how the scratches are starting to look across the surface. It's looking pretty nice. So the next kind of parameter that I have is a way to modulate even further the length of these scratches. So if I take a look at my next parameter, I have this length, and it's just a simple float slider. It has a default of 0.65, minimum 0, maximum 3. And so I have this slider that's basically allowing me to move from 0 to 3, and I want to modulate that. And I want to modulate the length of these straight lines by doing that. And so what I'm going to do is go back here into this quadrant node, and I'm going to go into this my function here, and I'm going to actually create an interpolation for that slider. So let's do that. Let's go ahead and click our function graph, and we're going to modulate our size here. So let's just take a look at our group, and let's just increase the size of this. Let's just make some more room here. Now remember, this bottom portion here is where we're actually working with our height, and that's what we want to actually have or modulate here with that slider value. So I'm going to create a constant float, and it's going to be 0, and let's copy and paste that float. And now let's make another constant, and this time it's going to be 3, because remember on that slider that I had, I basically had a min and max range, and I did 0 to 3, and so that's what we're going to use here. And then I'm going to hit the spacebar again and get a float value here. And so we'll place this guy about right here, and then in the drop down we're going to go and we're going to find that length parameter that I had worked with, or that I created. And so we'll just expand our little group here just a little bit more. And so now we have our values here. Let's just put these in place. So here's 0, and here's 3. See here, 0, here's 3, and then here's the actual length. So I'm going to hit the spacebar here, and I'm going to go in and I'm going to grab, let's see here, I am looking for a function, and I need a linear interpolation. And so I'm going to do an interpolation from the 0 to 3 based off that length variable, which is going to be our that user input field, which is our slider. And then instead of just using this float here, I'm going to just plug this guy in. And so we don't need this float anymore. I can just get rid of that. And so now we're going to be able to control a range between 0 and 3 based off that slider. and we're going to interpolate between that. So if we come over back to that scratches, we'll double click, we can select our length here, and so we can actually change this. So as I start to change my default, you can see that I'm changing the length as I work through that. Or I could make this, really, really large or smaller. So now I have basically this interpolation. Again, I can go from 0 to 3 if I wanted to on that. So I might pull these down to get something that looks more like this. And so now I have these two controls for that. So in this case, I now have completed my scratch noise, and I have a few parameters that I can work with, amount and length. And so now I'm outputting these here as a diffuse. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to change this to mask, and for the identifier, I'm going to change this to mask. So here we have this set, and I'll save it. Now what I want to do now is just show you how I actually use this. So I'm going to go ahead and I have this new graph that I created here. And we'll start here by, I have this material. So if I just double click here, I have this single material. And if I go ahead and just pipe this here into, I'm actually using just this material. If I go ahead and just expand this, just to give you a quick idea of what this is: diffuse, normal, roughness, and metallic setting. So this is just a pre-made material that I created. And I go ahead and just connect this to my outputs here. Here's what it looks like in the 3D view. And so what I wanted to do was I wanted to add my scratches to this. And so here's what I'll do. I'll just remove that, and I'll pull this down. So here I have my scratches. I'm just going to drag and drop those here into my graph. If I double click, so I now have this scratch parameter. I have an amount, so I can change the amount of scratches here. You can see that I'm actually modulating that, and I can increase the length if I want, or decrease the length to get something, a little bit different here. So you can see how powerful that it is that I used FX Maps to generate my own noise completely. It's very cool that we can do things like that in Substance Designer. So the next thing I did was I came over here to my material filters, blending, and what I want to do is I want to add this scratch effect here to this material surface. So I grabbed myself a material color blend. Here, I'm just going to do this from scratch completely. And I have this material color blend, and I'm going to, again, I'm working with PBR, metallic roughness, so I'm just going to go ahead and just make this connection here. And then I'm going to take this and feed this out here to all my connections. So I'm added this material color blend. And the material color blend is going to let me modulate my channels, being my diffuse, my normal, my metallic, and my roughness, based off this grayscale mask. And that's precisely what we have here as our scratches. So I'm just going to pull the scratches in here, and now you can see that right off the bat we're starting to get something here in place. So I think what I'll do, because of the way just the UVs are on this particular mesh, I think what I did was I just added a transform node so I could just tile it a little bit. So I'll go into my transform 2D, and what I'll do is I'll just kind of scale it in just a little bit, just to kind of just create a few tiles here, like this. So we'll get something like this. Now I'm going to come over here to my channels, and I'm actually going to change what channels I'm working with. So in this case, I'm not working with my specular, glossiness, and I'm going to turn off my ambient occlusion and my height. So we'll come over here to my channels, and let's say here for our metallic, let's go ahead and take the metallic property of this is all the way down to 0. That's what we want in this case. For diffuse, I'm going to just drop the diffuse value down kind of low. So I get something like this. And for my roughness, right now it's very, very rough. I'm going to pull my roughness down. So now you can see that the scratches are kind of, catching. The idea what I'm doing here is just kind of thinking of the scratches like, they're kind of denting into the surface, so they're really catching the highlights from the lighting. And then finally, we come over to our normal, and for height intensity, I'm going to switch this to -1, which is going to push into the surface like this. And so with that, actually, let me go over to my scene and edit this. I think I have some depth of field on. What I might do for my depth of field here is switch this into focus method would be automatic. Let's see if that's going to help me in this case. I don't think so. Let's just change my focal distance here. There we go. We'll just leave it something like that. So there's our scratches. Again, we can go back into that height. If we want to push this down, maybe something like -2 here, we can start to dig it into the surface like so. And then we can adjust the height opacity to kind of back that off a little bit if we want to in that case. So there's how I actually was able to use that. And again, let me just check all of my properties here. I don't want to go too dark with my diffuse. So in this case, my metallic is at 0. We're not working with a metallic surface. And we'll pull our roughness down a little bit more. So there we go. So now we have our scratches across the scene there. And I can then go back to my scratches and I can adjust the amount or decrease the amount. So let's increase the amount quite a bit. And I can start to work with my length. I can adjust the length of some of those scratches there to get, you know, this type of surface here. So that looks really cool. So there you have it. There's how you can use FX maps. They're extremely powerful, and we can use them to create our own custom patterns and noises. And you can see that the main trick to those FX maps is in the way that we think about how the tree processes. Again, it goes from the top to the bottom. We are then going to utilize a quadrant node to divide a mesh, or excuse me, subdivide an image. And then we're going to come into the final node that's at the bottom of that tree. And we're going to utilize those properties are going to be randomized by using a dynamic function. And then also as a tip, we showed that you could come into that top level parameter and you could set up sections of a function graph to handle all your different areas like size, rotate, position, luminosity, and so on. And those are all going to be local to this particular quadrant node that we have. And so with that parameters, we also talked about how they are going to process from the top down, and that is why we can place all those functions there.